How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation. In today's video, I've got 3 topics to cover as usual. The first one is that there was a huge PSN outage and we need to talk about why this is such a big problem. Second on the list, we have a positive update on the destruction of the PS5 home screen. And third, I want to talk about the Until Dawn movie because things aren't really coming together there. All right, let's jump into the first news story, which is all about this massive PSN outage. So if you were playing video games on Monday night, probably around 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you'd realize very quickly that you had no ability to play online because the PSN went down. Now, as usual, Sony said nothing about this, despite it affecting pretty much every PlayStation user in the entire world. If you go to that website, that's the PSN status tracker, it would show that the PlayStation Network was completely out. And this wasn't one of those little situations that lasts like an hour or two. This lasted over 8 hours, and even when they brought it back, it didn't work completely for everyone. Some people were having issues talking to their friends, some people were having issues staying connected to games, and it wasn't just like Space Marine 2, which has constant connection issues. It was like every game on the PlayStation Network would have issues staying connected to games. Now, I actually went and tried it last night. I had problems with Call of Duty, I had problems with Space Marine 2, and that situation is not good. So I said, surely Sony, after 24 hours, has said something about this, and no, they have not said anything about this, which in my opinion at least is completely unexcusable. Now, there's a much bigger issue here that I haven't seen a lot of websites talking about, and that's the whole license checking thing that's become a massive problem this generation. I never dealt with this in the PS3 or even PS4 generation because, if you didn't remember, you could download games to your PlayStation console instead of buying them physically, all the way going back to the PS3, and because of how good PS Plus was back then, I had quite a few games, and I would get codes for games for review and stuff when I was running my PlayStation fan website. So I had a lot of digital games, and until this generation, ironically, when I have the best internet of my entire life, it's better than my internet in college, it's better than the internet I had at my parents' house after college, it's way better than the internet I had in LA. I have never had more issues with single player games than I have during the PS5 generation, and that's because of this weird license checking rule that Sony has seemingly enacted. If you don't know what I'm talking about, essentially with downloaded games, your PS5 loves to check if you actually own that game, right? Like, you have a game installed on your PlayStation 5, and because they have the PS Plus Extra catalog, because they have the PS Plus Essential games, they want to make sure that you're not playing pirated material or playing games that are from your PlayStation subscription that you no longer have access to. So say you downloaded Horizon Forbidden West on PS Plus Extra when it was available, and then you stopped paying for PS Plus Extra, they increased or decreased the amount of time it takes to check for that license because they don't want you playing Horizon Zero Dawn or Forbidden West if you're not subscribed to PS Plus Extra anymore. But the detriment comes when you think about people who pay for their games, like me, who have a lot of digital games like me, and I'm trying to play these digital games and I can't because the PS5 is checking every 6 or 7 hours to make sure I own that game or have an active subscription that gives me access to it. And then when you have situations like this where the PSN just randomly goes down, you can't access the games you paid for, which I think is frankly total BS. And Sony's lack of communication this generation spans way farther than like PSN outages and everything like that. There needs to be a reckoning or something within this company where, you know, they need to acknowledge that they're not talking to us enough. There's no reason when the PSN goes down for 8 hours why we shouldn't get any update at all from Sony, because we're paying for this service, right? Like, it's not free internet that we're getting on top of our internet subscription that we have for our household every month. It's a paid service that just recently increased in price. They are now charging $80 a year to access the internet on your PlayStation 5. So if they're going to do that, they need to have a service that works 100% of the time. Like, I'll give them a grace period of Christmas or something when a lot of people get a brand new PlayStation and everyone's hammering the PlayStation Network all at one time, all on one day. That's fair. But when it's just a random Monday night in the middle of October, or the beginning of October, I mean, there's no excuse at all for the PlayStation Network to go down for even an hour, let alone 8 to 9 hours, and then still not work right after it goes back up. And there's even less of an excuse for Sony not to say something. So I don't know, if you work at Sony, you work on the network side, hopefully you can figure this out, but there needs to be some sort of change, because this generation alone, like in the past year or so, I feel like I've had to talk about the PSN going down for extended periods of time way more than I have in the past, which again is crazy considering how good internet is these days. It just shouldn't be a problem anymore. But you know, because Xbox decided to charge for Xbox Live, Sony in the PS4 generation started charging for PS Plus internet access, and because of that, their excuse of it's free is no longer valid because it's not free and it's incredibly expensive now. $80 a year is not cheap. It's more than a lot of subscription services out there, and what you get for $80 I don't think is great. I mean, yeah, you get 3 free games every month or whatever, but you know, the vast majority of the months are mediocre at best lately, and just something needs to change here because this isn't working. Anyway, that brings us to the second news story here, which is an update on the situation where Sony seemingly destroyed the PlayStation 5 dashboard. I'm sure you saw in my last video because it did pretty well, but basically what happened is those splash screens you would get when you hover over a game's tile on your PS5 dashboard, where you would see the background from a game and then like some music from the game, and sometimes they update based on where you're at in the game, which is really cool. That went away and was replaced by ads, or news for games. So if you go to like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you would see the big 10 out of 10 screen background showing you all the accolades for the game. If you went to Space Marine 2, instead of seeing Titus fighting a Tyranid with that white background, you would see an ad for the show they've been doing with Titus's voice actor, and people were pissed about that, rightfully so, because this is a console we paid $500 for. There's no reason to show me ads on the dashboard, especially for games I already own. And this is a situation where Sony actually came out and alleviated things on Twitter. It's crazy, guys. They went on Twitter and they told us it was a mistake with the latest PS5 update, and then they rolled out a fix later that night on Monday that fixed the issue. I'm glad they fixed the issue so quickly, but just the way things have been going lately with the back end of the PlayStation 5, I personally don't know if this was actually a mistake and if this was something they were trying to push through just to see if people would react. And then immediately, obviously, people reacted because it was a shitty feature, and then they walked it back very quickly. But between the update breaking Final Fantasy 16, if you didn't hear about that, they had to push out a hotfix for a software update for the PlayStation 5 because it totally broke Final Fantasy 16. Between PlayStation Stars going down for a month because allegedly they pushed the wrong update and it just broke everything and they didn't know how to fix it, and then the PlayStation Network going down for 8 hours at a time. This is eerily reminiscent of what's been happening at Xbox this generation, where they're just doing too much. They're focusing on building out the brand way too much, and because of that, they're neglecting the core services that build the back end of the PlayStation 5, and by neglecting that, issues get through that should have never gotten through in the first place. Everything I just mentioned not only was bad, but should have never happened at all, except maybe, you know, the PlayStation Network outage. It could have been caused by a DDoS attack or something like that. It all happened coinciding with Verizon going down across the country for hours at a time on Monday. So I'm not completely writing that off, but everything else, like a software update you beta tested for over a month getting through with a critical breaking bug that destroyed a game's performance that's technically an exclusive to the PlayStation 5, it just shows that they're neglecting the core services in favor of building out massive franchises for $400 million like Concord and then falling flat on their face with that. They're doing state of plays that they basically only salvage with one first party announcement when we're waiting on at least 4 or 5 games that have been in development for 5 years. I think I've said this in the past and people agreed with me, so hopefully you still do, but I think Sony just needs to take a step back and evaluate their core services and stuff that's not working, like they've just built on top of it for so long, like the PlayStation Network. They need to invest money, time, and energy into actually fixing those, because not only is it just something that they should do, but it'll make the experience better on the PlayStation 5. And then when you have we're so back, it's so over situations like we've had for the past month or so when it comes to Sony, people will be a lot more forgiving. But when you have all these little things building up, it makes people like despondent, or I guess like, I don't really know the word for it, but it makes people just depressed about the brand, and that's really hard to come back from. But what's not hard to come back from is irritation. Like if people are irritated with Sony, they'll get over that if they announce a bunch of first party games or some cool freebies or something like that. But if people are just bummed out and like depressed about a brand, it's really hard to come back from that. And when you have tons and tons of little teeny issues building up on top of each other, that builds just a sense of hopelessness and not feeling great about a brand that you're supporting with your hard-earned money. And if you haven't noticed, PlayStation has gotten exorbitant exuberantly more expensive this generation than they have in the past. And if they want to justify those increased costs, they got to provide a premium experience, not one that goes down constantly and has issues with software updates and has issues where you have to have massive fan outcry to actually get Sony to acknowledge their fan base that's spending all this money. I just really don't like when stuff doesn't work because, you know, that's the whole point of playing on a console versus a PC. You can put a game in the system, it'll boot up, you can play it for 6 hours, you can put it in rest mode, you can come back the next day, start it back up, you're exactly where you left off. It's a great convenient experience, and when you have things going down like this, it just ruins the entire thing from the bottom up. Anyway, that brings us to the third news story here, which is what's going on with the Until Dawn movie. So we know that Sony is working on turning their biggest game franchises also into movie franchises, and for the most part, it's working, right? Like Venom is not a game franchise turned into movie franchise, and they're doing a not great job with that franchise, I would say. But if you look at Uncharted, that movie made quite a lot of money. The Last of Us got critical acclaim. Fans seem to like the show as well. Things are going good on that front. But there's a weird outlier, which is the Until Dawn movie. So if you're into horror movies, follow my Twitter. It's Jimmy Champagne. I have it on the screen right now. I talk a lot about horror movies on Twitter, and I was looking into the Until Dawn movie, and it's a weird situation for a few reasons. First of all, you're taking a game that's a horror movie that's 6 to 8 hours long, and you're adapting it down to probably 90 minutes to a maximum of 2 hours, which means you're going to leave a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. I mean, if you haven't played Until Dawn, I don't want to spoil it because the remake's about to come out, but it doesn't all just take place in one house. There's a lot of locations, like a mental asylum, spooky woods, the house, the sewers and gutters, and like manufacturing facilities under the house. Like there's a lot of different locations, and I feel like if you're adapting a 6 to 8 hour game or 8 to 10 hour game down to 90 minutes, you're going to have to cut out a lot of those locations, which is kind of a bummer. The second weird thing about the movie is the cast, because they're not using anyone except Peter Stormare from the original games cast for the movie, which is incredibly dumb in my opinion, considering the game has somehow the best horror movie cast of really anything in a very long time. I mean, you've got Rami Malek, who's like Oscar nominated and I think Oscar winning. You've got Hayden Panettiere, who I grew up with being in every horror movie. I'm a Hayden Panettiere fanboy. I love seeing her come back as Kirby in Scream 6, and having her be a playable character in Until Dawn was incredibly smart. You've got the guy who played Agent Grant Ward in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. He's like perfect for a B-level horror movie. I think he did a great job in the game as well. The point is, the cast for the game is more star-studded than the cast for the movie, and that just should never happen. Now, there are a couple of things working in this movie's favor, which is great. First of all, the director, David F. Sandberg, he's the guy behind Lights Out, Annabelle Creation, I want to say, which is a great Annabelle movie. He basically fixed that franchise after the abysmal first Annabelle movie. He also took a sidestep into superhero jail, which is what I would call what Warner Brothers was doing, where, you know, if a good Conjuring universe horror movie came out, they would take that director like James Wan or David F. Sandberg and make them direct a superhero movie like Shazam or Aquaman, which sucked for me as a horror fan because I love James Wan movies, especially in the horror realm. The second great point is Gary Doberman revised the script. He didn't originally write it, but he's revised a lot of scripts in the horror world, whether it was It Chapter 1, he wrote It Chapter 2, he directed Annabelle Comes Home, which is a great movie, super underrated. He also is the director and writer of the new Salem's Lot adaptation, which Warner Brothers stupidly put out on HBO Max because I've heard it's very good. And then the last thing that really bugs me about how this movie's proceeding forward, I guess, is the scale. So it's really peak 2010s horror when you look at the way the game's scale is because of the 6 to 8 hour length, but also just the premise as a whole, like with multiple locations, a big cast, everything like that. That makes it feel like, you know, the movies we were getting when I was growing up, like the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Friday the 13th remake, even though it's terrible, the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, the Hills Have Eyes remake, the Last House on the Left remake. You know, like right now they make movies for $5 to $10 million and they make their money back. But back then they were spending like $100 million on horror movies and it was awesome. I mean, not all of them made their money back, but I go back to those movies all the time because they're so cool and big and bombastic, and it's not what you see out of slasher movies these days. And that's the area of budget and scale that the game fits in. But the movie looks like it's going more for the Blumhouse model, which is like $5 million, single location, unheard of cast, so they can pay them nothing and then give them money if the movie's successful. I think this is just not going to go well. And it shows that Sony really fumbled the bag with this franchise franchise because it should be a franchise. It's almost 10 years old, and outside of the original game, all we have is like PSVR spin-offs, which is weird. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you in today's video. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.